And effectively, Keir Starmer will have deregulation, and that will get Britain growing again. Now, obviously, we'll believe it when we see it.
If this all goes through, then by the end of this parliament, Britain will be a lot more French.
You've had a massive increase in non-EU migration to balance that out. Immigration as a whole has pretty much tripled since Brexit. We have nationalised land rights after the Second World War. I mean, this is sort of a Marxist socialist idea.
Hello and welcome to the IEA podcast. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Communications Manager and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Clougherty, the IEA's Executive Director, and Kristian Niemietz, the IEA's Editorial Director. We bring you a current affairs podcast with a difference. We want to go beyond the headlines and take a look at the foundational principles that matter to classical liberals. This week, we're going to be discussing the government's new pro-growth pivot, 5 years since Brexit, and what's changed since the early days of the IEA. Tom, would you like to kick us off with the first topic?
Yeah, sure. So this week, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, gave a big and much-trailed speech in which she talked about trying to get bureaucrats out of the way, trying to deregulate, and crucially trying to get Britain building. That really was the emphasis of the speech. I thought it was an interesting speech. I liked a lot of what she said. Actually, in a way, I was more impressed by the piece that the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, wrote in The Times the day before or the morning of, I forget which it was, where he was basically laying out the government's focus on growth, how they wanted to prioritise it, how they were going to pursue growth through supply-side liberalisation. And what I thought was particularly striking was the way he framed it at the end and kind of made it, this is the defining objective of my government. He said basically Thatcher had the Big Bang in finance, Tony Blair had globalisation, and effectively Keir Starmer will have deregulation, and that will get Britain growing again. Now, obviously, we'll believe it when we see it. I think that as impressive and as encouraging as a lot of this rhetoric is, it still kind of ignores the fact that on, say, employment law or on tax or on environmental policy, the government is steaming, pretty fast in the opposite direction. I think also we probably, from Reeves in particular, there was a big focus on this project and that project, and a lot of them were government projects, although some of them, many of them, in fact, would be market-led ones. And I think, I said this at the time, it's fine to have Downing Street get behind building projects and developments. But if we need Downing Street to throw their political capital behind something every time it needs to happen, that is not a sustainable approach. So you have to go from this project approach, which politicians love. They love reeling off the list of things that they can claim to be responsible for. And you have to get into those systemic reforms that mean that when private investors want to back something, they want it to happen when the demand exists for it. It can go ahead without governments gumming it up in the works for years and years and years on end. I mean, Heathrow third runway, I think, would be maybe the principal example of that. So I thought it was really interesting, first, that the government is focusing on deregulation as its key pro-growth strategy. Secondly, that so much of that tends towards the planning system and development and trying to stop the judicial reviews and the stupid environmental rules that mean you have to build a £100 million back cave along a railway line. And I also thought, and this was I think particularly interesting, that Reeves' speech was really shot through, I think, with this idea of agglomeration effects, which is what a lot of economists, and including economists on the free market side, have been suggesting is really holding Britain back. That although London is a major economic agglomeration, and agglomeration is good because you get more people, you get deeper labour markets, better job matching, more positive spillovers, greater specialisation, etc., etc. You bring more people, more businesses together in a place, and productivity tends to increase, and growth will result. London demonstrates those effects, but we limit London so massively, and we limit the broader southeast, where I think probably in an unconstrained market system, you would have millions of people from around the country moving to London and the southeast, and they would be able to because we'd have the development and the infrastructure to support it, and you would get a really kind of booming heart to the British economy. We limit that in London, and we also limit it in other cities which potentially could have other agglomeration effects as well, because we make development so difficult. I think that the government has this idea in mind when they're talking about things like the Oxcam arc, when they're talking about backing Heathrow development, when they're talking about, some green belt building, intensification in suburban London, etc., etc. So all of this is encouraging. Obviously, it's not a complete story at this point. There are still things the government's doing that are bad. It still remains to be seen whether they will actually make good on these new kind of promises that they're making. But I think we have to give credit where credit is due and say this appears to be a step in the right direction.
It's interesting. I think you're definitely right in saying that it's a step in the right direction in terms of reforming the planning system and actually taking deregulation as their pro-growth strategy. But in so many other areas, they're just doing the complete opposite. And I do think that, I genuinely believe Rachel Reeves when she says that she wants to achieve economic growth. I just don't think that there is much of an understanding about how you get from A to B. I think the one example is the Employment Rights Bill, which is just going to absolutely cause so much more, add so many costs to so many businesses, but also restrict the amount of the sort of liquidity within the labour market itself. People are going to be moving less, they're going to be specialising less, and it's going to make things a lot more difficult. Net zero, I think, is another big example of that. I mean, it is making Britain poorer, and it means that if we aren't building in the same way that she wants to do with housing, with energy infrastructure, we just won't be able to achieve the economic growth that they're talking about.
Yeah, I think one way of summarizing this conflict between policy strategies in different areas would be to say that if they get their way, if this all goes through, then by the end of this parliament, Britain will be a lot more French. Well, what I mean by that is, Britain and France are almost identical in terms of GDP per capita, but they get there in very different ways. So the French economy is one which, is obviously very far from a laissez-faire economy in the sense that they have very high taxes, I think the highest or second highest in the world, and also very tightly regulated labor markets. But they cancel out a lot of that by making the key input factors that you need for economic prosperity abundant. So in terms of infrastructure provision, they're far better than Britain. In terms of energy provision, far better. House building, we had a French intern here once who said to me, well, we have a housing crisis as well. And I said, okay, well, what do you mean by that? It turned out their idea of a housing crisis is very different from what we would mean by that. The problems that they have in the housing sector are the sort of things that we would consider luxury problems. So, and say if they make it easier to build stuff, infrastructure, energy, housing, but then also raise taxes and regulate labor markets more than now, then it would be a fair summary to say, well, we will have moved in a French direction. It's a trade-off which might be worth making. The problem that I have with it so far is that, they're importing some of the good bits and some of the bad bits from France, but the bad bits are already here and they are dead certain to happen. So there's no ambiguity here that we know for sure most of that is going to happen. We will have higher taxes. We will have a more tightly regulated labor market. The good things, the YIMBYism, that's a lot more speculative. So it's not just about the question, are the good things going to cancel out the bad things, but it's more that are the good things going to happen at all? That's the speculative.
Yeah. I think that this is a very astute characterization of where the government appears to be heading, and it introduces a degree of coherence that probably there isn't actually in their public pronouncements at the moment. Now, I think to be clear, if you read the Prime Minister in the Times, if you listen to what the Chancellor of the Exchequer has been saying recently, they don't want us to think that that is their agenda, to be more French. Certainly the way it is being described is as a much more radical kind of anti-bureaucracy, pro-deregulation sort of approach. But I think you're right. If you look at what government is doing in the round, there is that possibility that basically we do some good things in one area, we do some bad things in another area. It's pretty much a wash, and we're back in the same place, or we're stuck in the same place we have been for the last decade and a half, which is effectively low growth, economic stagnation, and everyone getting more and more irritated about it.
I think that's probably an accurate depiction of what's happening over the last 5 years as well. So I think that moving on to our second topic, just thinking about what it's like 5 years on from Brexit, I think it's really interesting because I've seen so much commentary this week about what went wrong or what went right, and some people saying they regretted voting for Brexit. And I think that what's interesting is there was never a final sort of agreement about what Brexit actually should have looked like and what our exit from the European Union could have looked like, what it actually meant when we said we're going to remove EU regulations. I mean, how many of them have we actually removed in the first place? I think it's really interesting because we can sort of step by step and actually say, hold on, these are EU regulations or these are EU imposed tariffs and quotas that we could remove that will genuinely make British people wealthier. One example I really like that I first heard from Lord Hannan was low-hanging fruit, Moroccan tomatoes. We still impose tariffs and quotas on Moroccan tomatoes, despite the fact that there is no protectionist case for it in the UK because our tomato growing season is entirely different to the Moroccan tomato growing season. And the only reason why we still have those tariffs and quotas is because we just haven't bothered to repeal them after leaving the European Union. And they're imposed by the EU in order to protect Spanish growers.
Well, funnily enough, I mean, that probably is part of it. And I don't know if this is specifically the case with Morocco, but as I understand it, the reason why there are still lots of weird tariffs on strange goods that we don't produce ourselves, and so there's no domestic protection case for, is basically so that we can give a tariff discount to least developed countries.
Yes.
So it's sort of an international development policy. It's a misguided one and a foolish one, and one that we should have broken free of the shackles of. But nevertheless, I guess it's an example of how bad thinking has led to a suboptimal Brexit. I mean, this is always a good topic for us because we tend to agree on a great many things at the IEAs. You'd expect us to, working together and fighting for free markets and a free society. But we did always have a diversity of views on Brexit, both whether it should happen or not. And then after the referendum, I think that probably everyone agreed it should happen. But the exact form it would take, again, was a subject of much internal debate. And I mean, if I just speak for myself here, you know, I was a Brexiteer before Brexit was a term. It was probably the constitutional case and the economic case for Brexit was one of the things that got me so interested in politics and policy in the first place. And then, I mean, it probably over time I got more interested in a lot of other topics, but that was one of the things that kind of inspired me as a young man, if that's not a very peculiar thing to do on the podcast. But I think if you look at the outcomes of Brexit 5 years on. And by the way, I couldn't believe it was 5 years. I mean, I lived near here in 2020. I can remember walking through Parliament Square early in the evening of January the 31st when they were sort of setting up for the big celebrations and everything. It was quite a grim and rainy night as I remember it. It does not...
There's a message there.
Well, it doesn't feel like 5 years ago, but also, bear in mind, the end of January 2020, we had no idea what was about to hit us and how messed up the next couple of years were going to be. So it's quite sort of striking to think back to that time. But look, I think there were multiple cases for Brexit. And if you're honestly assessing how has it gone so far, you should sort of assess it against those different cases. So there was the constitutional case that Brexit was about taking back control, to coin a phrase, that it was about parliamentary sovereignty or democratic sovereignty. And I mean, clearly, yes, we have taken back control of policy-making, law-making from Brussels. But has it gone back to Parliament? Has it gone back to the people, whether as individuals or whether as a sort of democratic mass? I would have to argue mostly not, actually. We've transferred power that was being exercised by unelected bureaucrats in Brussels, and we've given it to unelected bureaucrats in quangos in Whitehall and around the country. So, on the plus side, we are, to a much greater extent, the masters of our own destiny. So if we want to change that now, we can change it, but it hasn't significantly changed. And I think one of the absolutely classic examples of this, which I probably talked about before, was Solvency II, capital requirements for insurers. And this was supposed to be one of the big prizes of Brexit, that we could liberalise Solvency II, which was designed for European insurance markets, not for British ones, and everyone thought what we had before was better. Certain British politicians banged on and on about Solvency II at every opportunity. The great irony here is that the European Union reformed their Solvency II regulations after Brexit faster than we did. And the biggest hold-up in Britain was our financial regulators saying, oh, no, this is terribly risky. Don't think we like this idea. And our politicians being perhaps too spineless to stand up to them and tell them what was what. So the constitutional case, yes, we've gained something, but we haven't really done much with it yet. And I suppose on the economic front, it's much the same story, right? So for me, the economic case for Brexit was an opportunity to trade more freely with the rest of the world. That's an important thing. But crucially, to deregulate. I mean, that was, from an economic perspective, I think the big potential win from Brexit, that you break out of the Brussels bureaucracy, that regulatory ratchet that they have, and you take control yourself. And you use that control to pursue deregulation, to liberalize markets, to get rid of all of this ludicrous red tape that's been piled up over years and decades. Now, we just talked about it, maybe, unexpectedly, the current Labour government will actually start to make progress on this front. We shall see. Of course, it bears saying that most of the regulation that the Labour government is talking about is regulation that we were in control of before Brexit.
Yeah. Anyway,
I think nevertheless, you have to say, if you're being fair about this, whatever you hoped for on regulation from Brexit or from deregulation, it hasn't happened.
Yeah.
There have been a few things here and there, but almost nothing of real substance has changed in the last 5 years in the British regulatory state. That's a problem. Just going to say, immigration, a lot of people were motivated by lower immigration. EU migration, net migration fell, yes. Been negative for most of the time, I think, since Brexit actually happened. But of course, you've had a massive increase in non-EU migration to balance that out. Immigration as a whole has pretty much tripled since Brexit. So again, I think, unfortunately, people will say, if that's what you were voting for, it didn't really happen. And I think one final point is we should consider the opportunity cost of Brexit if we're doing a reasonable analysis of this. What if we hadn't had the referendum? What if the government had ploughed on with its plans post-2015? Have we missed out on a lot because we got distracted first by Brexit and then we went straight into a pandemic? I'm not really sure. I had a brief look back at the Conservatives' 2015 general election manifesto. There wasn't much to move my heart. There wasn't much that was inspiring. The one thing that I do remember, and of course we can all speculate what might have happened, what might not have happened. But there was a big furore around the time of the 2015 election that the Treasury's plans, George Osborne's plans as Chancellor, had the state falling to a level of GDP it hadn't been at since before the Second World War. So it was on a path by about 2020 to be 35% of GDP. Now, as it happened, you got Theresa May, you got Boris Johnson, effectively you got prime ministers who were not really fiscal conservatives in the same way that David Cameron and George Osborne had been. Instead of being at 35% of GDP before the pandemic, we were at 40%, and we all know what happened next. There may also have been some meaningful tax reforms, maybe some incremental improvements on education, on welfare and so on when you look back at the manifesto. It does seem that politics just was completely consumed. Policymaking was completely consumed by Brexit. Everything became kind of much coarser and much more divided, more partisan, much angrier, I suppose. And I think that hasn't been good for sensible market-led reform. I'm still happy that Brexit happened. The great thing is we've got the keys to the car now. So if we want to go in a different direction, we can, but we have to actually make that choice and we have to actually follow through on it if we're going to make a genuine success of leaving the European Union.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right. I mean, we left the European Union, we have those levers, but it's just about having the political will to actually pull them in the first place. Kristian, do you have any reflections on Brexit? I mean, you have a slightly different perspective.
That's right. I mean, as you said, Tom, this is an issue which is always divided, both the IEA itself, but also the wider free market liberal part of the country, which, is a very small part of it. But the reason for that is simply that the pro-Brexit people here always approach this thinking, what would I do if I were in charge of a post-Brexit Britain? What would I do if I were in charge of a Britain outside of the EU? And the counter-argument from the Brexit skeptics side, which myself has always been, it won't be up to you. You will not be in charge of anything. You will not get the kind of Brexit that you want. If there had been a referendum campaign about becoming Singapore-on-Thames and radically deregulating, then yes, I would be a hard Brexiteer. But the reason for the skepticism was that we just thought that was not going to happen in the current climate of opinion. And therefore, what that means is that if you leave the EU under those conditions, you will impose all the costs of leaving on yourself. And all the benefits, you're not going to realize them anyway. And I think that is pretty much what has happened. So we've imposed the cost of leaving, particularly the single market, on ourselves. And In terms of regulatory divergence, almost nothing has happened. And that is pretty much the worst of all worlds. So you deprive yourself of the benefits, and then you're pretty much just doing what you would have done anyway on the regulatory front, where we're just mimicking EU regulations, or the example that you mentioned, or doing something that's even worse.
I think that's undoubtedly true and well put. I mean, maybe it's worth saying 5 years. Politics moves so slowly. The third runway at Heathrow, I think, was first approved in 2003 or something, and we're still talking about it as a breaking news story now, 22 years later. So the 5 years after Brexit, I think we could have realistically hoped for a lot more things to happen in a free market liberalising direction. Maybe you're right. Maybe that was a bit of a pipe dream. I mean, I suppose the irony is you had governments composed of people who were calling themselves radical free marketeers. Unfortunately, they weren't acting like them. It would be a strange irony if now we had a government that was composed of social democrat bureaucrats and they decide to somehow make good on the deregulatory promise of Brexit. Again, this is one of those things we won't hold our breath for. I wouldn't go back and change things now. I've always thought that a decoupling between Britain and the European Union was inevitable. The tensions were there and they'd grown over time. There was going to come a breaking point.
And historically, we were never that embedded within the European Union in the first place. We weren't part of Schengen. We weren't part of other arrangements, and we weren't part of the Eurozone. We didn't take Euro. I think also just on that point, I mean, even our accession into the European Union was so torn. And actually, we all know the history, right? Charles de Gaulle did not want the UK to be a part of the European Union because they didn't believe that we were committed, and I don't think we ever really were committed.
True, but there's also, one cost of Brexit, or something that I would consider a cost of Brexit that hasn't really been discussed much, is, I think it's really weakened the free market liberal side insofar as it has fueled anti-Tufton Street conspiracy theories. Now, they were obviously a thing before, so I've been here for long enough to remember this. George Monbiot has been obsessed with us for decades, so it's not that only happened because of Brexit, but there has been. I'd say the difference is that until 2016, anti-Tufton Street conspiracy theories were mostly limited to the anti-capitalist left, people who would hate us anyway, who even if they were prepared to engage with our arguments, would never agree with us. And what has happened after the referendum is that that kind of conspiratorial thinking has migrated towards the center of the political spectrum, that you have people who, say, even in an ideal world, wouldn't agree with us, but who wouldn't be hostile to us either, now see us as their number one enemy. And that was not really a thing before, that you have the self-described sensible centrists, or the people who identify in that way. They were never particularly hostile to us before. And it's just this atmosphere that you described, the post-Brexit culture war, all that anger. They were looking for some culprit, some scapegoat, who made this happen, who dragged the country into this. And then they found the anti-capitalist conspiracy theories about Tufton Street and latched onto it. And that's become much more widespread since then. And it's reached people who it should not. These are people who are left-wing but not anti-capitalist. Yeah. So in a different universe, these people would not be our allies, but they would consider us, say, a respectable opponent.
Maybe now they all love supply-side liberalisation and we're coming right back into fashion.
Now they love us. It's certainly true that at 5 years after Brexit, a lot of levers that certainly could be pulled. Kristian, you wrote a really great piece for IEA Insider, our Substack, basically looking at and sort of reflecting on the IEA's history itself. What do you think has changed since the early days of the IEA?
Yeah, I wrote this in the context of the Ralph Harris centenary lecture, where I thought the big difference between our time and his, or say if he could see what we're doing now, thinking about what is it that he would instantly recognize, saying, oh yeah, this is just like back in my day, what would be things that would irritate him slightly or would seem strange to him. I'd say the big difference is simply that in his day and for the first, half century of the history of the Institute, was that we had easily identifiable enemies, ideological enemies. It was Ralph Harris spent most of his life battling against various ideologies that he thought were making the country poorer needlessly. Keynesianism, Marxism, the belief in an activist industrial policy. Now, these are all things that have not gone away, quite the opposite. Some of them have made a comeback. But also, they're not the things that explain why we've had this long-term economic stagnation, particularly since 2008. For that, we can't blame the socialists. I mean, we can blame them for many things, but that they haven't turned Britain into Venezuela. That's not the reason for the stagnation. Or even the Matsukatoites. Of course, they have more influence than I think they should have. But again, this isn't specific to Britain. You could say the same thing about pretty much anywhere in the EU. That would not explain why we're doing worse than a lot of EU economies. I think the issue that we've been obsessing about here, and for good reason, I'm sure we'll continue to obsess about it, this inability to build things, to provide infrastructure, energy, housing, offices. That's not the product of a specific ideology. So it's not that somebody comes in and says, right, I will design a system under which building offices will be impossible. Or I will design a system under which you can't build any roads and water reservoirs. So we don't have a clearly identifiable ideological opponent in the way that Ralph Harris had.
I think it's definitely true that NIMBYs, and not in my backyarders, are not motivated by a specific ideology, but they are definitely enabled by this kind of social democratic, or indeed this idea that the state should be so heavily involved in the regulatory system or the planning system in the first place. So NIMBYs themselves are not motivated by that kind of ideology that Ralph Harris was fighting against, but they certainly are enabled by an ideology that basically gives them the right to then restrict house building in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth bearing in mind that in a way, the British planning system is the great unreversed nationalisation. Well, I suppose you could say that about healthcare as well. And aren't they two of the biggest problems we have in public policy in the UK? A failing nationalised healthcare system and basically the nationalisation of previously private property development rights, which have meant that it's practically impossible to build anything anywhere at all, even when there is a very strong, almost overwhelming demand for it in London and the South East. And I thought, Kristian, your piece for the Substack really was very good and very insightful. And perhaps I should say as well that Ralph Harris, aforementioned, was the general director of the IEA from 1957 until about 1988. So a good long tenure, and we celebrated his 100th birthday with a speech in London in December. So I think you're right that the role of interest groups is so much more important now than perhaps it was in the 60s and 70s. It's not that they weren't there then, but I think they've become so much more powerful now. And the way that policy is shaped by these outside interest groups of various kinds, whether they're just kind of self-motivated or whether they're kind of NGOs with their own sort of ideology and set of principles. And you've got, the lawyers and the judicial reviews and everything and the bureaucratic independent agencies. We've tied ourselves up in so much red tape. We've just layered things on top. We've created basically veto players throughout our political economy, people who have the opportunity, if not just to say no, and many of them do have the opportunity to just say no, but also they can just interfere and they can delay and they can distract and they can impose so many costs on anybody wanting to do anything commercially that it becomes unviable as an investment. And I think that is the problem. And yes, you're right. So much of this is about understanding the interest groups and the way they operate. But I also think that there are ideas underlying all of this, and there are institutions underlying all of this. So in a way, it's still kind of classic IEA stuff that maybe Ralph Harris would appreciate. I mean, the very fact that we have nationalised land rights after the Second World War, I mean, this is sort of a Marxist socialist idea. The way that we put planning, I mean, we call it planning, at the heart of development is, again, a kind of a hangover of that old activist industrial policy, or the idea basically that the central planner, the man in Whitehall, knows better than the market, that you can design something better than would emerge via spontaneous order. And we've put bureaucratic discretion, people in government positions deciding things for you, above private property rights. So I think this thing is shot through with ideology. And yes, I mean, I think you should work on multiple fronts at once if you want to try and combat this. you have to take on those interest groups, or you have to try and effectively bribe them, come up with clever ways of flipping their incentives. So instead of blocking change, they accept it or even endorse it. I think you have to think of institutional design and how can we change the way government works so that these things don't happen. So you take out all of those different veto points that you have at the moment. But ultimately, you also have to change the underlying ideas that are shot through this whole system. And those are the ideas basically that the government should decide, the government should plan, the government should shape the direction of the country or approve, and that we can't trust people to do the right thing with their own property in their own self-interest, and for that to have socially beneficial results in the long run.
I think it's absolutely true, and I think that changing those incentives is particularly important. Well, Tom, Kristian, thank you very much for joining me today, and thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you are interested in learning more about the IEA's work, then do consider joining insider.iea.org.uk.